let's look at Testimony 7 on page 56. Mario, do you want to read that? Page 56, T7.
It says, he sees the four elements changing into one another. He does not think that it's right to identify the underlying reality with any single one of them. It must be something distinct, coming to be. He holds does not involve any alteration of basic substance.
Storchion.
This results from the separation of opposites, which the eternal motion causes.
Okay, so right. So instead of picking one of the four elements, he just is that this something called unlimited. This stuff, and so and then it's the separation of opposites. So the unlimited is separated into opposite things like fire and water and air and earth, thanks to motion of the universe. But it doesn't, coming to be, a change doesn't involve any alteration of the basic substance there. I mean, stoichion means element, so it doesn't involve the alteration of water like it did for Thales, right? Everything is just water. Rather, there's this unlimited that is taking on different forms. Okay, text 11, James. Next page.
Anaximander held that the unlimited is the first principle and is eternal, without age, and that it encompasses all the worlds. Moreover, that it is in perpetual activity, and that out of its activity the worlds have originated.
Okay, so if it's eternal, that means there is no beginning. So this is a beginningless universe, right? The universe didn't have a beginning, and there was just always moving. It encompasses all the worlds, right? There's other worlds as well. Okay, Matthew T14 on next page. Or actually, let me think. Before we get into that, why don't we read T18?
T18. It was the opinion of Anaximander that the gods come into existence and perish, rising and setting at long intervals, and that there are countless worlds.
Okay. So, actually, to modify the translation here, or to fix the translation, what it actually says is, the Latin there is eosque, if you look at the Latin of Cicero there. So what it says, the gods come into existence and perish, right? Rising and setting. So the fact that he says they rise and set, right? That doesn't seem like we're talking about Zeus and Hera here, right? And then he says, and that the gods, the same, are countless worlds. So the gods are just worlds. So like Jupiter, right? Think of it this way: Jupiter is the name of a planet, correct? Well, he's saying that's what Jupiter is. That Jupiter is not a person. Jupiter refers to a planet. Like, it's easy, right? Because in English, Venus, we name the planets after the Greek deities. So he's saying that's all they are. The gods are just names of planets. Okay? They come into existence and perish. I mean, it's scientifically speaking, he's actually right? I mean, the planets were formed, and in terms of astronomy, eventually, if nature is just left to itself, they would perish, because eventually the sun will turn into a red giant, right? And now it'd be however many millions and millions of years from now, but the fact that he says rising and setting at long intervals, it shows you when he says the gods are rising and setting, like, right? If you think about astronomy, the planets will appear sometimes, at different times of night or day, in the evening. So that's his naturalism, right? So see how this is helping us. How should we read Thales? Well, he's certainly, Anaximander is quite naturalistic here, that there's nothing supernatural. And then T19, right, the last sentence, nor did he any more than Thales attribute the cause of all the motion of the universe and astronomy to a divine mind. So if there's testimonies that seem to talk about that, well, that makes clear, no, there's no divine mind. So first, main things are, right, only one first principle instead of many, or instead of picking an element. Naturalism, and then his other thing is he's the first person to talk about evolution. So just briefly here, so there's a distinction, typically we do this in the spring, a distinction that's made between micro and macro evolution. So macro means like on a big scale, and micro means on a small scale. So macroevolution is life itself. So can life itself just come from non-living matter, just basically spontaneously? And then the kind of major kingdoms of life, right? And then you go from basically plant to animal, major kingdoms. And then the third thing, there's three things that macroevolution entails. Is human, right? So right, somehow from, or plant, animal, all those distinctions are made by purely, basically random processes. And is human life, which is self-conscious, right? And he's not making this distinction, but it's going to be clear from what he's saying that that's what he thinks happened. Because what are the gods for him again? Planets. The gods are not. They're not. There's not. So this is the thing with Thales. I'm not saying that Thales is 100% naturalist, mainly because he just didn't say enough for me to say. He says all things are full of gods. What does that mean? I don't know. The man that has soul. Maybe it wasn't clear in his mind. Correct. Anaximander, it is clear that he's a naturalist because he said the gods are just the planets. So it's clear that there's nothing divine here, and he doesn't say all things are full of gods. He doesn't say all things are full of souls. See, so what that just lets us know, he's not a panpsychist and he's not a pantheist. So he's basically Anaximander. I think we can safely say is 100% naturalist, whereas Thales was 90%. Who knows, right? 50%, 80%, depending on how you want to read it. So if this is 100% naturalism, then all these things happen without any divine intervention. Remember what Xenophanes had said, right? If God had not made a honey, figs would taste sweeter. So Xenophanes, right, contrast, as I mentioned before, right, the design argument, where God is the source of, basically, God is creator, right? God is the source of order in living things. So he made them to some degree. So why do I say to some degree? So what, so basically this is the ancient debate, right? Anaximander is a little bit earlier than Xenophanes, right? So Anaximander is saying everything that you see, every living thing you see was purely a result of chance, right? Was there a Prometheus who formed the first humans? No. Was there, I don't even think the Greeks talk about who made the animals, but they did talk about, I think it was Prometheus who made the humans. The ironic thing is it's not even someone important. It's not even like Zeus. It's one of the Titans, kind of like humans are an afterthought. This all results from chance, right? Or what he described in that one fragment. There's some kind of blend of chance and necessity. Because remember, he said that things change by necessity, but then he's also going to talk about chance. So there's some kind of blend of chance and necessity bring about life and everything else. And then in contrast to that, once again, Xenophanes doesn't go into detail. He just talks about God making the honey and so on, which means, right, he made bees, right, so on. But then Socrates, on the other hand, was quite explicit about this, right? God made all these different animals for our benefit and so on and so forth, okay? So that debate, and right there, that's very helpful because oftentimes, if you just picked up a book on philosophy of religion in the English-speaking world, as often as not, they'll say, well, this debate began in the 1800s with Darwin and then William Paley. That's where they'll begin the debate. Maybe, I don't know, I'd have to survey the textbooks. Maybe some of them mention there being a previous debate, but pretty much the way it's framed is Darwin came up with natural selection, and then William Paley was saying the opposite, and it's been around, this debate has been going on for 200 years. Well, actually, what is this? he's whatever, 580 BC, 550 BC. Okay, so this has been around for thousands of years, and people have been weighing in on it for thousands of years. Socrates, I mentioned Plato, Aristotle, right? Plato, Aristotle, they also hold the design argument. The Stoics, right? The Stoics hold it, right? Cicero was a Stoic, as the case is, right? So this was, if anything, the common view in philosophy for several thousand years, except by materialists and naturalists who are saying, well, there is nothing divine, so if there's nothing divine, it had to all happen by itself. Okay? So let's look at the testimonies here.
So Anaximander is both naturalist and materialist.
Yes, exactly. So the Milesian school they're definitely all materialists because the first principle is matter. And naturalism, Thales, maybe not 100%, but Anaximander, I think it's safe to say 100% naturalist. And I think definitely Anaximander. That's what we're talking about right now. Okay, so who's next? Did you read? Brother, did you read? Okay, do you want to do T14? So it's quite astonishing how prescient this is, considering this is 2.5 millennia ago.
Animals, according to Anaximander, came to be from vapors raised by the sun, and man came into being from an animal other than himself, namely the fish, which is 30 times the animal.
Okay, so see the idea of major transitions in life happening by, right, humans came from fish, right? We came from the sea. Why did he say that? Well, they did have some awareness of fossils. There's, I don't know if they're mentioned in any of these, but there's one or two mentions of fossils, but one of the other of the pre-Socratics, of like seeing basically fossils for like sea creatures up on top of a mountain. So they were aware that like the worlds have been around for a long time, and so that's probably the inference he made by seeing fossils of sea creatures up on a mountain. He figured, well, the sea creatures must have come first. Okay. Next. Griffin?
15.
Yeah.
He says, too, that the earliest times men were generated from various kinds of animals. For whereas the other animals can quickly get food for themselves, the human infant requires careful feeding for a long while after birth. So that, if he had originated suddenly, he could not have preserved his own existence.
Right. So, it's certainly an accurate statement about humans being more helpless than other animals. Right, he is kind of aware of the problem of survival, right? So, I mean, this isn't Darwin. It's actually not just Darwin. It's actually this guy named Alfred Russel Wallace who also said, contemporaneous or even a little bit earlier, came up with the idea of survival of the fittest. But right, he's aware of that being the problem. How do things survive? And the different, basically, body types. Nowadays, they call that phenotypes in evolutionary biology. Next one, Jake.
So, T60. Anaximander says that men were originally generated in the bodies of fishes, that after birth they were reared in the way that sharks are reared until they became capable of protecting themselves. And that eventually they were cast ashore so that they had to learn to live on dry land.
Okay, so see, this is evolution. I mean, it couldn't really be clearer, right? They were generating the body of fishes, and then actually it turns out that sharks are viviparous, right? So they give birth to live young, which is exceptional, because most fish, right, don't do that. So he's aware of that. So remember I said these are the first scientists as well. That's why he rightly called them the scientists, philosophers, and elitists. Until they came to protect themselves, and then they were cast ashore, so they learned to live on dry land. So it's obviously, it's very simplistic compared to modern science, but the basic idea is there of, last one, Robert?
The first animals, according to Anaximander, were generated in moisture and were covered with a prickly skin, which as they grew older, dried and broke off, whereupon they continued to live for a while without it.
Right, so he's trying to figure how can life just come from the elements, right? Because there's unlimited, then there's the elements, and how did life? So in T14, he's saying, well, maybe it was from the vapor, maybe it was from steam that living things came. In 17, he has a more maybe elaborate, extended explanation. Well, there was some kind of moisture or water that formed a kind of covering, the kind of thing that you can see happening in nature. Like he's trying to use natural processes to explain how life began, right? You guys can see that, right? Meaning, I don't know, like there's this pond and then, I don't know, a film forms on it because there's dust on it. He's trying to figure out a natural process. Did you have a-
So did Charles Darwin ever quote or source any of this in his works?
I should think that he himself, would have maybe mentioned it, but I actually don't know. I'm not sure. I haven't read enough of him to know about that. It's more the narrative, though. The narrative is at least in philosophy of religion, and really more in general. The narrative is that he's the one who really discovered evolution. But yeah, though maybe anyway. That's how because the narrative presents it as like a novelty, as a scientific discovery. Therefore, if we're scientific, we should agree with it. So, but as we saw, and the thing to see is that if there's no God, then there had to be some natural process. So whether it was from the vapor, whether it was from the moisture, there was some kind of film that formed, and then it broke off, and there was a living thing. However it happened, it couldn't have been by. Now, of course, the myth said it was, I think, Prometheus, but for them, it's God, right? As we saw with Socrates, and so I guess that what I want to do here is make a distinction. So, in terms of contemporary philosophy, right, and also science, because it's a kind of overlap of the two, right? That basically this is problematic. So this macroevolution, in terms of contemporary, I'll just use green. Macroevolution is problematic because, and so the person who argues against him is Aristotle. So Socrates did mention, remember, Socrates certainly knew about Anaximander, right? And he just said, well, God made the animals for us. Remember, he made the sheep so that we could have this, and the cow so we could have milk. So already, Socrates, all these people are rejecting that idea. And Aristotle is the one who really argues at length and gives the best reply to it. And he specifically is arguing against Empedocles. So he actually gives you more details on what Empedocles teaches. Empedocles. The other evolutionist who we're going to see is Empedocles. So I'm getting it. So this is, Anaximander is the first one who teaches about evolution, and then the second one is Empedocles. So there's two. Empedocles is like 150 years later. So in the physics book 2, he argues against this. It's chapter, I guess chapter 8 to 9, at some length. And basically, he just says that he basically gives the design argument, except it's much more involved than that. He gives, in physics book 2, he's the first person to define chance philosophically. He points out that the previous philosophers were pretty much determinist. What does that mean again? Anybody determinist?
No free will.
Well, yeah, but in regards to nature.
Everything was already predetermined.
That's good theological, and that's good in terms of the human. But here we're just talking about nature, natural determinism. It's just that everything happens by necessity, right? So he's actually defining chance, defining necessity, relating them, and then using that to make the design argument. So it's much more involved than just Socrates saying the sheep are there for our benefit, because someone could say, well, it just happened, right? It happened to turn out that way. They just evolved that way, and now it's for your benefit. But it wasn't planned that way, you see. So he's giving a much, much more rigorous, detailed argument against Empedocles. However, they're not really aware of what you would call microevolution. So this distinction is actually, it predates him, but this is from Pope Benedict XVI. Really, it's when he was Glastonbury. But he makes this very well. And, right, so what he says is microevolution no one can really debate about. So microevolution is you have an existing species that then changes or adapts to its environment. So an easy example of that, right? Just take a bear. You know, the bears in the Arctic are white, right? They have accidental differences. They've adapted to their environment by being white. Then there's black bears and brown bears, right? The bears live in the forest aren't white. Okay, so that's an obvious example of species adaptation. So species adaptation, this is where I'm pointing out Ratzinger here because, right, in the 21st century, they're not really aware of microevolution. I say not really because Aristotle does say that the dog is descended from the wolf, which is kind of a little bit like, right, the adaptation idea that domestication is certainly kind of adaptation of animals changing over time. But, so this certainly is something that Ratzinger makes this distinction. He says species adaptation no one could debate, right? You can't debate that happens. But then he goes into a fair amount of detail about how that life itself can just come from unliving matter. He says, like, there's still no proof of that or evidence for how that could happen. And likewise for the major kingdoms, and especially for human life, right? So for human life, if you just say that we came from apes and that's it, well, then we don't, how do we have an immortal soul? How do we have an immaterial soul? So at the very least, right, this can't work in a materialistic way. There has to be God giving intellectual soul. So God has to be involved there as opposed to the strict materialist evolutionism, all right? Now, so when I call it evolutionism, I'm taking it kind of as an ideology where it goes along with materialism, there's no God, there's no soul, etc. Okay? So anyway, this is what Ratzinger says. He says, right, that's the distinction he makes, is between micro and macro, okay? So anyway, that's showing you kind of the ancient debate and the very extremely brief kind of modern application. Okay? So obviously that's a huge topic, and in the spring, typically, we spend more time on that. We come back to that, and because it's really by nature a vast topic because there's tens of thousands of different kinds of animals. So I mean, if the more detail you get into, you could kind of get into as much detail as you want. Like, okay, so what exactly did the bear evolve from, or where exactly you draw a line? And where to draw the line is basically a matter of getting into fossils and all this stuff. But the big picture, for example, that God has to give us an immaterial soul. You see that kind of thing. On the other hand, is clear, right? At least for Aristotle. Okay. So why don't we go on then? Because to Anaximenes. Why don't we actually let's read at the bottom of page 4 of the definition sheet, just to conclude with Anaximander. You can go.
Okay. Want me to read Anaximander? Anaximander tells the basic principle for all 4 elements is the aperon.
So the accent is to indicate that you stress that. So aperon.
Aperon. Okay. Elements is the aperon. The boundless, unlimited macroevolution, infinite worlds, extraterrestrial life.
So we don't have all the testimonies here, but some other ones he talks about. So the macroevolution you can see right there. It's macro because life itself came, and then everything from life itself on is all completely evolution. Infinite worlds, we don't really have that per se. Although he did talk about the other worlds, but in other testimonies it says he held that he held that the universe was infinite. It had no limit. And there's other worlds, and it seems like there's infinite worlds. And then also extraterrestrial life is something that's mentioned in other. So that's also quite interesting. that he's, but those testimonies aren't in here. Okay, so let's go on to Anaximenes. And by the way, extraterrestrial life, that's another whole, there's books on that. One scholar who wrote what do you call it, a compendium with all the people talking about extraterrestrial worlds, starting with, I think the first one is Anaximander. From Anaximander to the present day, philosophers talking about extraterrestrial worlds. Like, so you might be surprised. Kant said that Immanuel Kant said that the planets have to be populated, that Mercury and Venus, they have to be populated because a priori, right? He was always focusing on things from an a priori perspective. Wouldn't make sense otherwise, and so on and so forth. So yeah, so it's interesting that he's the first one to talk about these things: extraterrestrial life, evolution. Okay, so Anaximenes. Here, there's only one fragment. There are others, but he doesn't. He just gives you this one. Matthew.
Sorry.
Okay.
As our souls, being air, hold us together, so breath and air embrace the entire universe.
Okay. So, what are our souls made out of?
Air.
So, what would you call that? Materialism, right? And remember, don't minimize it. I mean, he's saying your soul is made out of air. Like that's it, right? And our soul holds us together because think about it. When you die, right, your body decomposes. So that air is somehow the air that your soul is holding you together. Very primitive science, if you will. So breath and air embrace the entire universe. So would we think that what kind of things have breath, normally speaking?
Things that they live.
Is he agreeing with that? Matthew?
No.
Why not?
Because he's saying everything.
Breath is in the whole universe. It's not just in living things. So see, once again, the naturalism, instead of it being that, only living things have breath, he's saying, no, breath is in the whole universe, right? Huh?
As I'm thinking about them trying to describe abstract concepts, I think I brought this up last time, it's not a literal interpretation, or is this like them grasping at words that they have a concept for, but they don't have words to use to describe those abstract concepts? So he's using air as a way to describe a concept that he doesn't have a word for.
Well, I think that he's, remember, there's 4 elements. Thales said that water was the principle of everything, right? Anaximander said, no, instead of having one of the 4 elements, I'm just going to pick the apeiron. I'm going to say it's something unlimited. It's something beneath them. And then here he goes back to picking one of the 4 elements. So he's disagreeing with Anaximander. Remember, Anaximander wanted it to just be something indefinite, and he wanted it to be something definite. He's like, well, what's that? What's this unlimited? I mean, he's saying that's not satisfactory. You're not even telling us what that is. Water is kind of problematic because it doesn't seem like all these things are made out of water. So then he's going to say it's air. So I do think when he says air, he does mean something like what we're talking about. And then breath. Remember, the soul is compared to breath for the ancient Greeks, right? When you breathe out, your last breath is the soul. That's the word psyche is from the Greek verb psychein. Psyche means like cool or like blow on something. So the word psyche is related to the idea of your last breath. And so what he's doing is the same way that Thales said that everything has soul. He's saying, well, let's focus on soul as breath because psychein means to cool something like blowing on it, where we get our word psyche, which is where we get the word psychology. And so he's saying, let's say that breath is the first principle, and that's what kind of is how we explain everything, air and breath. Because air is kind of stable, but then breath means that it's moving, right? Like breath by definition, or like the word psyche means to blow. So it's kind of explaining motion, or trying to explain motion. So he's trying to come up with one thing to just basic principle to explain all these different phenomena.
I do have a question. I just think it's probably after class.
Yeah, let's keep reading because it's kind of like there's the fragment that each testimony kind of gives you. We saw it with Anaximander, right? Each testimony gives you a better picture of what's going on. let's see, T1, right, of how literally you should take it or not. Who's next? Is it T1?
Anaximenes and
Diogenes
treat air as prior to water and as the most fundamental of all simple bodies.
Right, so he's saying that instead of water being the basic element, air is prior. It does say in T4, he held that first was air, and that this is the unlimited. So see, he's saying just to call it the unlimited is not helpful. Air is what's unlimited. So that if it's unlimited, that implies that the universe is unlimited, because the universe is made out of it. He wrote in the Ionian dialect in a plain style without affectation. So also prose writing, it shows you this is some of the first prose writing in Greek, because of course Homer and Hesiod were both poets, right? It's called epic poetry. So this is some of the first prose authors. And then it says, right, he flourished, or he died in 528. Let's see. Do you want to remember T5?
From 62.
Yeah.
He says that all things, even gods and demons, come to be as products of air.
Right, now you might think, okay, is this like Epicurus? Because Epicurus is a materialist, later, right, after Socrates. But even though he's a materialist, he actually thinks there's gods that are material. He thinks that doesn't think they care about us. But then if you take this in light of what Anaximander said, because remember, this is Thales taught Anaximander, and Anaximander taught Anaximenes. He said the gods are planets, right? Do you want to read the next one, Christian?
Anaximenes of Miletus, son of Eurystratus, was an associate of Anaximander and agreed with him that the essence of things is one and unlimited. On the other hand, he declared that it is not indeterminate, but that it has the specific nature of air, which differs in rarity and density according to the kind of things which it forms itself. Rarefied, it becomes fire; condensed, it becomes wind, then cloud, and as the condensation increases, it becomes successively water, earth, and then stones. Everything else gets made out of these.
Okay, so this is kind of his big contribution. I mean, all right, air, but that he gives a process for how that change can happen. Like, okay, everything's water, but I mean, how does water turn into different things? And the process is actually it's a very helpful concept in terms of basic science, right? Rarefaction and condensation. We all know about water condensation, and steam is kind of rarefied water, right? So, because you might wonder, like, how does air turn into stones? Well, now you know, right? Rarefied, it becomes fire. Condensed, it becomes wind, kind of similar to the idea of breath, like something's moving. Then cloud, which is, I guess, right, more dense than water, and then earth, and then so on. Okay, so T8, when air is imperceptible normally, but then if it becomes visible as a result of moisture, so thinking like steam. The air is always in motion, for if not, there would be no changes. This is testing T8. So the idea that the air is just naturally always moving, that's important, like the problem of motion. Really, this is kind of getting you into the whole question of inertia, even this early on, right? Are things just always moving by themselves, or do they have to be moved? Aristotle's going to say there has to be a prime mover. But the atomists are also going to say the atoms are just always moving, which actually is kind of true, it turns out. In gases, the atoms are just always moving from their own inner features. So it is fascinating to see these ideas being introduced and right, how far back Western science goes. T9.
Motion, according to Anaximenes, has existed forever.
So once again, the beginningless world, right? So notice all the Milesians have this kind of infinite world, beginningless world. Okay.
He adds that the earth came to be from a compression of the air, that it is very broad and rests on air.
So here the earth being, of course, the planet Earth. Okay.
Sun, moon, and the other stars came to be as products of the earth.
Right, so figuring, the sun and moon, they're both solids. They're heavenly bodies, assuming that they're solids, right? He doesn't know that what the sun actually is. He's not making a distinction between the planets and the stars, right? Like we know. Okay. All right, well, let's look at the definition sheet.
Anaximenes held that air is the basic principle, rarefaction, air, to steam, smoke, fire.
So the reason I use the Greek word air there, obviously that's where we get our word. There are various words in Greek that are used for air. So they have this word ether, air in Greek. Ether is like the upper air, like that's very dry, and air is like the lower air that's moist. I think they have maybe another word or two. Then there's the word pneuma, which means breath. Pneuma is where we get our word spiritus, means breath in Latin. That's where we get our word spirit, like the Holy Spirit. It's pneuma hagion. So these are important words that eventually get incorporated into the New Testament to talk about spiritual things, like psyche, right, soul. So this is seeing the origin of them. Right, the process. Main thing for him is just giving a process of how the change takes place, which is certainly progress. Okay, so that's basically it for the Milesian school. You see how see the similarities, right? That we pointed out. So let's go on. So why don't we just go on to the Pythagoreans? So this is page 200 to 234, and on the syllabus here I have mathematicism, morality, and reincarnation. So like the big three themes for the Pythagoreans. Why do I say Pythagoreans? Well, can you guys hear me okay? Am I talking loud enough? Okay, good. I say Pythagoreans because Pythagoras himself, it's really kind of fascinating how all these important historical figures don't actually write anything. Socrates didn't write anything, even though he's kind of, this is why they're called pre-Socratics, right? Because he's so important. Jesus didn't write anything. I don't think the Buddha wrote anything. And Pythagoras didn't write anything. So that's why he calls it Pythagoreanism, because it's pretty hard to establish what Pythagoras taught and what he didn't, as compared to his followers. Now with Socrates, it's not quite so hard because we have Xenophon, and Plato, and we can compare and contrast and figure out kind of what's later from Plato and so on. But with Pythagoras, he didn't write anything. But still, certainly the importance of math is something we'll see here. So let's see. Let's look on page 200. So he says the city of Crotona had been founded as early as the 8th century, so the 700s, by Greek colonists. I think it's kind of funny because America was a colony in the 1600s, and they were colonizing in 700 BC, so colonizing Italy, and it was said to possess the best school of medicine in any of the Greek colonies of the West. So the Greeks kind of colonized various parts of the Mediterranean, including Italy. So that's why they'll say Pythagoras. I think I mentioned before, like the Italians, that often refers to the Pythagorean school. Pythagoras established a school of his own, distinguished by his pursuit of mathematics, astronomy, music, metaphysics, and polydaimonistic theology. That's an interesting word that he makes up there. So instead of saying polytheist theology, right, because like all the pre-Socratics, he's not just on board with the myths. He calls it polydaimonistic. Remember, the daimons are the spirits. So I think Wheelwright is correct there. We don't want to just call it polytheism because he's a pre-Socratic. But on the other hand, he does think that there are spirits. So kind of moving in the direction of Plato. Remember how Plato has those 4 kinds of spiritual beings? So this is a step in that direction, like getting away from the anthropomorphic deities, but there still are spiritual beings that are helping us and so on. By discipline, community life. Let's read the document page there, Matthew, by this 201.
Okay. Community. Is that what you said again?
So by the word by.
The end of the first line.
First line. I already read the first part of the sentence, and there's a semicolon, so I'll let you read.
To be done. Oh, sorry. That's at the bottom. Okay. By disciplined community life, which included both a daily regimen of activities and studies, and the practice of non-possession by sharing unreservedly all the necessities of living, and by carefully guarded conditions of membership, which nevertheless allow, for the first time in history, so far as it is known, the admission of women as members.
So they were this kind of monastic, somewhat monastic life is what we would call it. Right, the monastic ideal is not unique to Christianity. So you can see this predates it by quite a bit. I think this also predates the Essenes, actually. The semi kind of monastic life in Palestine in the days of Jesus were the Essenes, you may have heard of. But right, very ascetical, right? Like they had practice of silence, fasting. So kind of what that shows you is, these are natural virtues that can be practiced and discovered. Right? Human nature is not totally corrupt. Right? There is good in human nature, and you can discover these things even without the help of revelation. Right? Like in the early Christian monks. So, right, a regimented life of activities and studies, sharing all their goods, right? This is familiar to us from monasticism. Okay.
Unfortunately, the inhabitants of Cretonia regarded the school as an intruder, and its head as a dangerous wizard who was rumored to have a golden thigh and possess various queer magical powers. Hostilities mounted, and at length, when Pythagoras had become a very old man, there was a mob uprising which made a vicious attack upon the school, burned the buildings, and murdered or exiled the members.
So, if you read, we don't read the Apology of Socrates, but when he's defending himself, right, it's his legal defense. He says, he says, if you put me to death, it'll be the same thing people have already done to other philosophers before me. So, unfortunately. And remember, part of the picture here is he has a very kind of strict morality about temperance and moderation. And, on the one hand, right, there's the good of human nature, but there's also the bad of human nature. And so you can see that it doesn't always, people being told that they're not living the right way or that they should live differently is not always well received. So, and then there's different, right, it gets murky with history, how he died. Did he die in that kind of attack on the school, or did he survive and then die later? Okay. Next, Joe.
The nature.
Yes.
The nature of daily living in the school, both its morals and its intellectual disciplines, can perhaps be understood as an intellectualized development of early mystery cults, such as the
Eleusinians.
The main Eleusinian prince involved two steps: purification and revelation. The ritualistic sea bathing by boys undergoing initiation and the dramatic exhibition in the dark room of the sacred grain stalk and the flash of light.
So remember in the book by Edith Hamilton about the myths. So the Eleusinian Mysteries centers around, remember Demeter and Persephone? When the deal that they make is that when Persephone goes to spend the winter with her husband, Demeter's weeping because her daughter's not with her, so winter comes, and then they're having like shared custody almost of the daughter, and then when she comes back to the earth, it's spring, right? So what the Eleusinian Mystery did was make that, because remember the official religion, it's a political thing. There's these glorious temples. You go, you take part in the sacrifices. Once again, interesting for New Testament purposes, right? Because that's the world that St. Paul talks about that. Are Christians allowed to eat the meat that comes from the sacrifices or not? That's a whole big thing in the Pauline epistles. And eventually Paul says, yeah, you can, because it doesn't matter. Just it doesn't. It's just meat. But so see what I mean? There's a political side to it as much as anything else. So the Eleusinian Mysteries is a more personal thing where that kind of idea of purification so this is right, the human, I don't know, psyche, the human persona is searching for something more than just a superficial political religion. And you know, once again, these are things that would have maybe helped prepare for people for the gospel, right? You could see this as part of the preparation for the gospel, like the idea that there's some kind of purification that's needed, right? This is part of just religion in general. If you go to Japan, I have like my brother. That actually helped me understand Greek religion a little better. You have to wash your hands. It's very simple, but you always wash your hands when you go into the temple precinct. So just the idea of like a transition, a purification. And so Catholicism, it takes what's human and then it elevates it. Remember, grace perfects nature. So we're taking a natural thing that just even naturally you would think, yeah, that's a good way to kind of convey to myself, like I'm going into, I want to leave everything behind and think about something else and think about something bigger and more important. And then of course we have actual holy water, right? So anyway, yes, but same thing in Japan, like it's kind of like a holiday, but it doesn't necessarily mean the person is deeply committed just because they're going to the temple to like the teachings of Shintoism or Buddhism, but everyone goes and it's a festival. So the Eleusinian is a more private kind of religion where it's more like, okay, Demeter is taking care of me. So you could see how maybe this would help people to probably some of those people, you know, they became Christians, right? I mean, they were the people who became Christians. Like, oh, well, this is kind of like grace perfecting nature. This is what from myth to true religion. So he says, let me summarize some of this. The practice of silence each morning, right? So he's saying Pythagoras and taking over the basic pattern, minimize the ritual, right? Ritual gave way to purposely guided action. So they had silence in the morning, between rising from bed and a sparse breakfast, strengthening one's power of memory by practice, community meals, reading aloud, right? So interesting to see how by nature, right, you can, in a sense, the harmony between grace and nature and how grace perfects nature. And then on the next page, he talks about, right, the music of the spheres, an idea that goes back to them. Okay, so that's kind of so there's two sides to Pythagoreanism. There's this religious kind of side to it, and then there's also a mathematical and scientific side to it. Who's next? There. Next page, furthermore, on page 202.
Furthermore, it had been discovered empirically by practicing musicians that changes in pitch can be produced by pressing down a vibrating string or by blowing through different lengths of otherwise identical pipe. It remained for Pythagoras to discover that if one string is twice the length of a second of the same character, the result in acoustical terms is that unique harmony of sounds, the octave.
So mathematics, music, and then tying all this together, and let's read the bottom about Pythagoras.
Pythagoras did not stop there. To extend one's generalizations is tempting, and the musical generalization became broadened into a metaphysical one, which virtually came to serve as the badge of the school, that all is number. Research into the nature of number and its associated ideas was made the central theoretical discipline, with the result that the word mathematica, a neuter plural connected with mathema, learning, and so originally signifying things taught and learnt, gradually became attached to the more restricted meaning which the word mathematics has carried subsequently.
So that's the origin of our word mathematics.
So it was his fault.
Finally
Okay.
know the guy who invented math.
So I do want to read that introduction a little bit because there are a whole bunch of testimonies that we can't read all of them. So I want to get the big picture. And then we'll just read a couple of the testimonies.